A book in 10 minutes. Today's book is probably the most famous book, the Bible. The book of the Bible is actually a book of books. It's a collection of many, many books together in one big book. And a lot of people don't know actually what's in the Bible. So I thought it'd be good to give an overview of what this is really about from my perspective in 10 minutes. The first 5 books of the Bible are the books of Moses. They're the Pentateuch or the Torah. These are the original 5 books that Moses, we believe, wrote down through inspiration that describes the origin of humanity, not in a scientific way, but in a religious way, in terms of the theological explanation of man's origins. The book of Genesis up through Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy deals with the covenant that God made with the Jewish people. There's a series of covenants actually from the time of Genesis with Adam, and then we have the story of Noah. There's a covenant made with Noah, and then we get all the way up to the time of the Exodus and the covenant made with the Jews through Moses. And so the books of the law are really for the early phases of God's people, the central texts that really give the story its initial impetus, or the first act, you might say. Then we have the story of the history of Israel, the nation of Israel, God's people who are called out to be a specific group, to have a specific type of worship, to have a specific way of living that would point the nations in the direction of the worship of the one true God. However, this turbulent time of the Old Testament, which encapsulates not just the Levitical worship style of Israel and the animal sacrifices in the temple, all of which in our view were intended to gradually move mankind away from the rampant idolatry that existed in the world and human sacrifice even, towards a purified, restored worship of the one true God. There was this expectation throughout, even from the time of Genesis into the prophets, into the liturgical songs of David, the Psalms, as we know them today. There was this expectation of a coming Redeemer, a Messiah, one who would fulfill all of these promises of the wrongs that have been accrued through human failings and through human frailty, the restoration of mankind to relationship with God. If we think about Genesis, when man falls, there is this removal of communion with God. Man is banished from Eden. And Eden is this archetypal sort of mountain garden city, you could say even, where God and his people would have communion. That communion is broken by man's choice to align himself with a fallen angel, Lucifer or Satan. That communion is restored eventually when the Messiah comes. That's the promising, that's the hope of the nations. Not just for the people of Israel, but also for the Gentiles as well. Thus, dozens and dozens and dozens of prophecies throughout the Old Testament, from Genesis 3 with the promise of the seed of the woman crushing the head of the serpent, all the way up through the promise to the patriarchs that the seed of Abraham, for example, Genesis 12, 15, 17, 22, that the seed of Abraham would come who would bring the nations into the worship of the one true God. This is then followed with many psalms. As we said, David, the king of Israel, wrote many worship songs, is really what we would call them, but they're meant to be sung in the structured worship of Israel at the temple, the synagogue, etc. And these psalms have a place not just as worship songs, but also as predictions, as prophetic theological statements, not just about the coming of the Messiah, but his kingdom, his church, his ecclesia that he would set up, and the nations that would be coming into that church or that kingdom. And also the final state of things, where we would go in terms of the resurrection. And thus the bodily resurrection can't be divorced from this Messiah's conquering of death. One of the reasons that in the Orthodox view, the descent of the Messiah into Hades to destroy the power of death through what we call the harrowing of Hades, that was so necessary because the other world religions, they might believe in or profess an idea of some kind of resurrection. There's no real notion of the destruction of death or the destruction of the demonic powers that must occur. For us, that is the place of the Messiah. And the Messiah doesn't just do this in some sort of, warfare, earthly significant sense. He He does this in a spiritual sense, in that he destroys the demonic powers that have a stronghold on the nations, primarily through idolatry throughout the Old Testament period. But even still today, there's a lot of nations that still do engage in idolatry. And so the expansion of the church, which in our view is the kingdom of God, according to Christ in Matthew 16, Matthew 18, and many other passages, that kingdom of God then encompasses and draws in the nations, as we read of, for example, throughout the prophet Isaiah. Prophet Isaiah is sometimes called the fifth gospel because so many of his passages discuss this future kingdom, this Messiah, and this bride of the Messiah, this bride of God, which would be this new Israel, so to speak. The new Israel, according to Paul, is the church. And so for us, the church and the Messiah are the fulfillment, really, of what the expectation of Israel was, what the expectation of the nations was, you see. And even the minor prophets, right, when we get into Malachi, describes when the Messiah comes, the Gentiles will offer incense to the Messiah and to the one true God of Israel. So for us, the Bible is a cohesive, covenantal text that's written for God's people, but God's people ultimately are those who have faith in the Messiah. Jesus says to the Pharisees in John, "Though if you have seen me, you've seen the Father, and those who follow me are the seed of Abraham." So the true seed of Abraham are those who have faith in the fulfillment of the faith of Abraham, the Messiah. Jesus said, "Abraham saw my day. He believed in me." Jesus says that in Exodus, he was the one talking to Moses when Moses went up on the mountain. So it is, in our view, Christ that is the Messiah, that is the expectation of the nations, and he's the one that is the cohesive element for both the Old Testament and the New Testament. By the time we get to the New Testament, we have these writings that are called Gospels, and these are four Gospels or four accounts of the life of Christ and his ministry. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are known as the Synoptic Gospels, and they focus for different audiences, sometimes towards Gentiles and sometimes towards Jews, on the history and the parables. And then the fourth being John's Gospel, which is the more elevated theological gospel. That gospel focuses on the deity of Christ and his ministry in terms of the full revelation of the Trinity. Now, in the Orthodox view, that doesn't mean the Trinity wasn't always taught. It was. God was always Father, angel of the Lord, and then his Spirit, all throughout the Old Testament going back to Genesis. They didn't have a full worked out theology of the Trinity per se, but they did have a faith in that triad, and that's what the meaning of, for example, the famous Rublev icon is, where we have the visitors coming to Abraham to dine with him. That is, of course, the Logos dining with Abraham, just as the Logos dined with Moses on the mountain in Exodus. It's the same message, it's the same story, and that fulfillment occurs in this feast, this marriage feast, just as Christ was having this feast with Moses, this feast with Abraham. So this new feast that he institutes for his church for the last 2,000 years, post the upper room of giving the Lord's Supper, that feast is the Eucharistic marriage feast of the Lamb. And every divine liturgy for us is the celebration of precisely that feast. It's identical to that. That is the marriage feast of the Lamb. It is an eschatological or end times reality that is also here and present in the now at every divine liturgy. And thus for the Orthodox, the liturgy is really the context, the milieu from which the Bible is supposed to be heard. It's fine to read the Bible. Many Protestants kind of see it as a personal and devotional text, but that's not really the context of what it is. It's much more than that. The Bible is really a liturgical book meant to be read in the public worship service or liturgy of the church. And in the Orthodox Church, it clearly has that structure and that ordering by which the highest of these in the liturgy, for example, is the Gospels. So the Gospels are really sort of the pinnacle. We also have this book of Revelation after Paul's epistles and the other apostles that wrote, like Peter or John's epistles. We also have the book of Revelation, which John tells us is a summation of the whole history of God's people, as well as the history of the world, culminating in the final restoration of Eden in this new heavenly Jerusalem, or in the eschaton, in the restoration or recapitulation of everything back to the way it was supposed to be before man fell in the garden. And so the Bible is thus a coherent whole of covenantal structure, where the covenant made with man is fulfilled in the final covenant of Christ, and the realities that are brought, the end times reality brought at the first coming of the Messiah to be fulfilled in the second coming, in the bodily resurrection and judgment. So the Bible for us is thus that whole piece, that whole unit structured around these covenants, revolving around the person of the divine Messiah. If you like this analysis, hit like and share. Also,